Star Wars has always been visually obsessed with destruction, yet strangely allergic to consequence, and nowhere is that contradiction more apparent than in how it handles civilian death. Planets burn, cities crumble, fleets collide, and entire systems vanish in seconds, yet the people who live in those places rarely exist as anything more than abstract numbers or emotional prompts for named characters. This is not an oversight. It is a structural storytelling choice that quietly erases the largest casualty of every galactic conflict: ordinary life. The galaxy is constantly at war, but its civilians die off screen, unheard and unmourned, turning mass death into atmosphere rather than event. The Clone Wars are the clearest example of how planetary warfare becomes normalized while the human cost is deliberately blurred. Entire worlds are invaded, blockaded, bombarded, or occupied. Yet the camera almost never follows civilians through those experiences. When Coruscant is attacked, we do not see hospitals overwhelmed, evacuation corridors jammed, or neighborhoods collapsing under orbital debris. We see Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi dogfighting above the skyline. War becomes choreography. Destruction becomes spectacle. The civilian cost is implied but never examined, allowing total war to be framed as a series of tactical problems rather than a humanitarian catastrophe. This pattern continues into the era of imperial occupation, particularly in stories set during the early rebellion. Worlds like Lothal, Jeddah, and Ryloth are shown under oppressive rule, but civilian suffering is presented as background texture rather than narrative focus. We see closed markets, frightened crowds, silent streets, but rarely follow a family losing their home, a worker forced into labour, or a community fractured by displacement. Occupation is communicated through mood rather than lived experience. The story tells us people suffer, but it rarely lets us feel how, because doing so would pull attention away from heroic arcs and towards structural cruelty that cannot be resolved by a single victory. The destruction of Alderaan is the most glaring example of this erasure. Over 2 billion people die in seconds, an event so vast it should permanently destabilise the galaxy, yet the narrative treats it primarily as a symbolic loss. We focus on Leia Organa's grief and Wilhuff Tarkin's cruelty, not on the planetary scale consequences. There is no refugee crisis explored in depth, no interstellar famine ripple, no sustained examination of what it means to erase an entire culture, ecosystem, and population. Alderaan becomes a moral punctuation mark rather than a demographic annihilation, a narrative device rather than a lived catastrophe. Even more uncomfortable is the way Death Star battles are framed as unambiguous triumphs, despite the likely civilian death toll involved. Each Death Star is not only a military installation, but a massive artificial world containing engineers, technicians, administrators, contractors, medical staff, and support workers. Many of them were likely conscripted, coerced, or simply employed within an authoritarian economy that offered few alternatives. When the station explodes, the audience cheers. The story never pauses to acknowledge that this is a mass casualty event on a scale rivaling planetary genocide. Civilian death is not just ignored here, it is aestheticized as victory when it aligns with heroic goals. The sequels escalate this pattern to almost absurd levels. Starkiller Base annihilates entire systems in moments, and the narrative barely slows down. There is no sustained aftermath, no exploration of refugee worlds absorbing billions of displaced people, no sense of galactic economic collapse or psychological shock. The scale of destruction grows exponentially, while its emotional weight shrinks. Destruction becomes a visual shorthand rather than an experience. The higher the numbers climb, the less human the story becomes, until mass death functions like a fireworks display rather than trauma. This raises an obvious question. Why does Star Wars avoid confronting civilian death so consistently? The first reason is moral simplicity. Acknowledging civilian casualties would immediately complicate the hero narrative at scale. Once you admit that rebel attacks, Republic campaigns, and resistance strikes also kill civilians, the clean moral divide starts to blur. Star Wars is built on mythic clarity. Heroes are good, villains are evil. Civilian death disrupts that clarity by forcing uncomfortable questions about collateral damage, proportionality, and justified violence. the franchise prefers symbolic morality to systemic accountability. This avoidance also protects the moral pedestal of institutions like the Jedi and the Rebel Alliance. The Jedi wage massive wars in populated systems. The Rebels sabotage infrastructure in civilian zones. The Resistance destroys megastructures without fully interrogating who was inside. If Star Wars lingered on the real toll of these actions, it would undermine the assumed moral superiority of its protagonists. The story would have to reckon with the fact that even righteous causes produce victims, and that heroism does not negate harm. That is a level of self-interrogation Star Wars rarely allows itself. Just as importantly, Star Wars treats war as a personal experience, rather than a societal one. We experience conflict through Luke, Anakin, Rey, Cassian, never through displaced families, amputees, or civilians navigating the aftermath of destruction. This framing keeps the story intimate and emotionally accessible, but it comes at the cost of realism. The galaxy becomes a stage for destinies, not a civilization experiencing collapse. War feels meaningful to characters, but strangely weightless to the world they inhabit. Acknowledging civilian death would also shift Star Wars from fantasy into political tragedy, fundamentally altering its identity. Once you start following food shortages, migration crises, broken planetary economies, and generational trauma, the saga stops being a mythic adventure and becomes a war chronicle. That shift threatens the escapism that made Star Wars globally iconic. The franchise repeatedly pulls back from that edge, choosing emotional shorthand over structural truth. At its core, Star Wars is far more comfortable exploring how heroes feel about war than what war actually does. It asks how Anakin suffers, not how Naboo's farmers suffer, how Leia grieves, not how Alderaan's children died. The camera follows lightsabers and starships while the galaxy bleeds quietly in the background. That silence is not accidental. It is a boundary the story refuses to cross. This is why civilian death remains the galaxy's quietest casualty. Not because it isn't happening, but because the narrative is structured to look away. And that refusal to look, more than any superweapon or Sith plot, may be the most haunting truth about Star Wars, a universe where entire civilizations can vanish, and the story still moves on without ever truly stopping to mourn them. The few moments when Star Wars does allow civilian suffering to surface are striking precisely because they feel alien to the rest of the saga. Brief ruptures, where the myth falters and reality presses through before being quickly sealed over again. These moments stand out not because they are graphic, but because they linger just long enough to suggest what the galaxy usually refuses to confront. And then, almost immediately, the story retreats back to heroes, symbols, and destiny, as if afraid of what sustained attention might reveal. Consider Jeddah in Rogue One. For a short time, the story slows down and allows us to feel occupation as something lived rather than implied. We see crowded streets, economic suffocation, religious suppression, and a population living under constant threat. When the Death Star fires on the city, the devastation is not framed as an abstract victory or a distant explosion, but as a sudden, terrifying annihilation of ordinary people who are already barely surviving. This is one of the rare instances where Star Wars lets civilian death feel like civilian death. And notably, it happens in a story that is explicitly positioned as a war film rather than a mythic hero's journey. The moment works because it breaks the franchise's usual rules, but even here, the focus quickly narrows again. The destruction of Jeddah becomes a stepping stone toward larger objectives. The emotional aftermath is not explored in depth. Survivors are not followed. The long-term consequences are not examined. The story acknowledges the wound just long enough to motivate the next phase of the mission, then moves on. Civilian suffering is permitted only insofar as it fuels narrative momentum, not because it deserves sustained attention in its own right. A similar pattern appears in Andor, which more than any other Star Wars project flirts with the idea of treating civilians as the centre of the story rather than its background. We see labour exploitation, surveillance, arbitrary punishment, and the slow psychological erosion of living under authoritarian rule. Ordinary people are not symbols here. They are trapped participants in a system designed to grind them down. And yet even Andor largely stops short of fully exploring mass casualty events. It focuses on pressure, fear, and injustice. but not often on the aftermath of large-scale destruction. The show gestures towards civilian cost rather than fully inhabiting it, perhaps because fully doing so would push Star Wars into territory that is no longer myth-adjacent, but uncomfortably real. These rare acknowledgements highlight an important truth. Star Wars is capable of engaging with civilian suffering, but chooses not to make it central. When it does, the tone shifts dramatically. The galaxy feels smaller, harsher, and less romantic. Blasters feel less like adventure props and more like instruments of terror. Victories feel compromised rather than triumphant. This tonal shift threatens the franchise's core identity, which is built on emotional uplift, archetypal struggle, and the promise that individual courage matters more than systemic cruelty. Civilian death undermines that promise by revealing how little individual heroism can actually protect most people. There is also a deeper structural reason this subject remains sidelined, because sustained attention to civilian casualties would force Star Wars to confront scale honestly. The galaxy is vast. Wars span thousands of systems. Casualty numbers would reach into the billions repeatedly. At that scale, grief cannot be personalized easily. You cannot give every loss a face without overwhelming the story. So instead, the franchise abstracts death, turning it into scenery, spectacle, or motivation rather than consequence. The galaxy bleeds in aggregate so that the story can remain focused in close-up. This abstraction serves another purpose. It protects the audience. Star Wars is a global cultural touchstone, watched by children and adults alike. Dwelling on mass civilian death, refugee crises, and generational trauma would shift the saga from escapist fantasy into something closer to historical atrocity. That does not mean those themes are absent. It means they are carefully managed, softened, or displaced onto symbols. A planet explodes instead of millions of individual lives ending. A crowd runs instead of families being separated. A skyline burns instead of a food system collapsing. The implication is there, but the emotional labour is deferred. The cost of this choice is subtle but profound. By consistently sidelining civilians, Star Wars trains viewers to understand war primarily as a proving ground for heroes, rather than a disaster for societies. Violence becomes meaningful when it shapes a protagonist, not when it destroys a community. Suffering matters when it motivates action, not when it simply exists. This framing mirrors the perspective of power rather than the experience of those crushed beneath it, which is deeply ironic for a saga that positions itself as a rebellion against tyranny. It also creates a strange moral asymmetry. Villain-inflicted civilian death is framed as monstrous, while hero-adjacent civilian death is framed as regrettable but necessary, or not framed at all. The destruction of Alderaan is an atrocity. The destruction of the Death Star is a victory. Both involve unimaginable loss of life. The difference is not the scale of death, but the narrative alignment of the victims. Star Wars avoids interrogating this asymmetry because doing so would force it to admit that righteousness does not erase consequence. This avoidance shapes how we remember the galaxy's history. We remember battles, not famines. We remember duels, not displacement. We remember speeches, not shortages. Entire civilizations vanish between scenes, and the story marches on. The silence around civilian death becomes part of the universe's texture, a constant hum beneath the action, that is never allowed to become foreground. That silence is not neutral. It is a choice that shapes how violence is understood and justified. In the end, the reason no one talks about the civilian death toll is not because it is unimportant, but because it is too important for the kind of story Star Wars wants to be. Acknowledging it fully would demand a different moral framework, one where victory is always compromised, heroism is always partial, and endings are never clean. Star Wars occasionally brushes against that reality, then pulls away, choosing myth over mourning. And that is why the galaxy's quietest casualty remains unnamed, uncounted, and unresolved. Not because the people are invisible, but because the story cannot afford to see them for too long without becoming something else entirely. The stars burn brightly, the heroes endure, and somewhere beneath the spectacle, entire populations disappear without ceremony. Their absence felt only as a silence the saga has learned to live with.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars, and my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.